Hello, Michael Parker here. I'm the founder and the head coach at Forge Online Personal Training. I just want to thank you for joining me for this edition of the Truth Series. So in this video webinar, we're going to tackle the truth about carbohydrates. To start, we need to explore what carbohydrates are and how they affect the body from a cellular standpoint. Because understanding the intricacies of carbs are going to allow you to make more informed decisions about how carbs can be included into your dietary lifestyle. And carbohydrates have been kind of the relentless target of modern media scorn. Our poor little carbs, oh man, they have been beaten up and bullied, and there's a lot of unwarranted and very negative stigma surrounding carbohydrates. And the demonization of carbohydrates, in my opinion, is simply the product of ignorance, gullibility, and unfortunately there's greed. And that always leads to consumer exploitation. And the reality is that carbohydrates have been grossly generalized. We've kind of just lumped them into this big singular group without any delineation for monosaccharide, disaccharide, polysaccharide, food source quality, and hormonal response. Don't pay attention to any of that. We just call them carbs. Carbs are bad. Also, not just the media, but sadly, fitness products, fitness services, fitness personalities. They just completely ignore microbiology. Okay, they always cite science. They cite convenient science. But really what they're doing is that they're producing sellables. They're manufacturing fad diets, and they're appealing to fear. Either they're appealing to your fear or our desire to just like justify consuming outrageous quantities of bacon and putting butter in coffee and stuff like that. I don't know. The bottom line is that my objective is to actually do 5 specific things. The first one is I want to explain in simple detail exactly what carbohydrates are and what they do in the body in a very simple way. I want to expose the complexity of the topic and show how all the startling misconceptions about carbs, but also show how I can understand why those misconceptions are even there. The third thing I'd like to do is I want to provide you some scientific and chemical information to support healthy carb consumption. And then the fourth thing is outline, give you some ideas, look at an outline of carb typing, give examples of food sources so you can be in a better position to make choices that are relevant to what you're trying to accomplish with your fitness and nutrition lifestyle. And fifth, my underlining theme, one of the reasons I even started Forge, is through education. I want to empower you to make better nutritional choices. And gosh, hopefully you can improve your relationship with food. That would be really nice. So we're going to just dive right into our first slide. There might be a slight delay on the slides here, so let me see. Okay, no, that's been through. We're going to dive right in. Some simple sciences, really simple, but it's all related to carbohydrates. But we have to ask, what are carbohydrates? Because not all carbohydrates are created equal. And one of our objectives today is to share with you the difference between complex carbohydrates, which are just basically comprised of sugars, starches, and fibers, versus those that are simple and they're just simply made of 1 or 2 sugars. So all carbohydrates, they just have 4 calories per gram. I just want to point out that they have the same caloric value as protein. And at the core, carbs are compounds that are comprised of single or multiple sugars. So we chemically shorten carbohydrate to CHO. That just signifies carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the configuration of CHO or carb is going to determine its complexity, its digestibility, and its glycemic yield. So basically, complex carbs are going to meet your body's energy needs. They feed your brain, they assist your nervous system, and they keep our digestive systems nice and fit. And of course, within calorie limits, they can actually help you keep you lean. This is because carbs, they're protein sparing. That means that carbs, they basically protect against something called excessive gluconeogenesis. And that's just the function of converting non-glucose based components of your physiology into glucose, namely your hard-earned muscle. Carbs also reduce nitrogen in the system, such as urea, most specifically urea. And those urea can burden the kidneys and liver pretty badly. Carbs also aid in cellular respiration. They do something where they facilitate with insulin the transportation of molecular energies through the citric acid cycle, and then of course the production of adenosine triphosphate or ATP, and that's done through the electron transport chain. You know what though, the TCA and the ETC, they're actually really very complex. It was by far the most challenging biological functions for students to grasp when I was teaching college. So I'm gonna have to just do a separate video on those for y'all, but I'll get back on track. Let's talk complex versus simple carbs. The very basic sugar unit, the very basic one, is just a molecule that contains 6 carbon atoms together with oxygen and hydrogen, and it makes up a monosaccharide. When you have bonded pairs, that's a disaccharide. Complex carbohydrates have long chains of sugar arranged to form starch or fiber, and those are polysaccharides. And hold tight though, because I'm going to show you, I have a couple of examples of what those look like. And we're going to go to the next slide. Oh, sorry for the delay, geez. Okay, so why bother knowing these things? Why bother? I think that it's very important to outline the sugar qualities found in carbohydrates so you understand how to make better decisions regarding your food intake. And just, you know what, let's just avoid the fad diet trap altogether. Because essentially, there are 6 common sugars in nutrition. 3 come from your monosaccharides, and the other 3 come from your disaccharides. There are other sugars, there's like xylose and ribose and so on, but I'm just going to keep this very basic and specific. And it's likely that you've heard of many of these common sugar types because they all end with ose, and that only just means sugar. So while a sugar type may sound pretty similar, all of them exhibit some very distinct characteristics. So glucose is most popular name for sugar, followed by fructose. You have galactose, then you have lactose, maltose, and sucrose. And those are the carbs that we're going to basically be going over today. And glucose by itself is a single sugar, and it's used in both plant and animal tissue for energy. That's what it's for. Fructose would be your fruit sugar. Galactose is a milk sugar, and then lactose is just a slightly more complex milk sugar. Maltose is a malt sugar. And then finally, we have our sucrose, also known as a table or cane sugar, and that, my friends, is the sugar along with some high fructose derivatives that are highly addictive. And in my opinion, those are the source of the carbs are bad mentality, and all of that nonsense that goes around it. So, but before you know, y'all grab your pitchforks and your torches and storm my castle for that comment, I do want to make an acknowledgement here. There is a fraction of people who have a sensitivity to carbs. There are people who are medically predispositioned or just they don't feel good eating a lot of carbohydrates, or maybe they just don't make the best decisions about their carbohydrates. But in general, this information that I'm going to share with you is common knowledge in the nutrition sciences community. This is nothing groundbreaking. It's something that every nutritionist, registered dietitian, or advanced personal trainer knows. It's all been converted and perverted into misinformation, and I just want to clear it for you. So we're going to go to the next slide. Okay, simple carbs. Let's go into those real quick. Some popular ones. Well, here's what they are. They're just carbs that include either the raw form or products that are containing stuff like the sucrose, the super refined sugar, brown sugars, corn syrups, high fructose corn syrups, honey, glucose, fructose, and just plain old table sugar sucrose. And the one that I don't like is that fruit juice, like this frozen, that concentrate fruit juice. Blech, I think it's so gross, so acidic. But anyway, those are all monosugars, and they can be found refined in great quantities in all these mainstream food sources. You got your soft drinks, your cereals, your baked goods, your enriched white breads, and your pastas, and your candies, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other products. Even our spaghetti sauce is loaded with sugar, and that's just mind-blowing to me. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide here, and let's look at a little bit of a further breakdown. Let's look at some of the basic chemistries as it relates to each of these sugar types. And kind of hone down that understanding. And let's show why some carbohydrates are far more preferable to others. So, and this is also going to expose a little bit about why we have so much confusion around carbohydrates. So check out our fun little glucose molecule, courtesy of Turning Heads Design. She always does such great work for me. So here you have those 6 carbon atoms together with oxygen and hydrogen, and that's going to form your simple little monosaccharide. And by the way, just to point out, just for fun in chemistry, this is an alpha D glucose molecule. If you want to know, a beta would just be a repositioning of the little oxygen guy right there on the right lateral aspect and making it superior to the carbon atom. And that would actually just be the difference between cellulose and a starch chain. So it's kind of cool how just one repositioning of a teeny little component of something chemically can just alter everything. It's pretty cool. And I'm going to show you actually how that works here in a second. So the common monosaccharides, they include glucose, fructose, and galactose. And it's the molecular arrangements that are going to result in the degrees of sweetness. And just in general, fructose is the sweetest. So anytime you see a fructose bond, you know it's going to be sweet. But I just want to point out, though, about fructose. The total volume that you're going to get in fruit, it's not significant. And it's definitely not significant for most people to exclude or minimize fruit in their diet. And that is directly related to the glycemic load and glycemic response, or your insulin response. And we're going to cover that later. And I'm going to debunk that myth for you with the fruit is bad because it has sugar. But if you overeat, if you're overeating and you're having fruit, then yeah, fruit can make you fat. I just want to say this, that if you're overeating and then you eat fruit, it wasn't the fruit that made you fat. It was everything before the fruit that made you fat. So just keep that in mind as we go to the next slide here. I'm going to try and have fun with this. So let's see. Okay, disaccharides. Let's dive into those. So lactose, sucrose, and maltose. And here's a fun little molecular example of table sugar. So you can see how it's a bonded pair, which makes it a disaccharide. You got your glucose and fructose bond there. Another interesting distinction between monosaccharides and disaccharides is how the body absorbs them. So a monosaccharide, they go straight to the blood, right up. You get a big blood sugar spike. Your insulin goes up, and all that good stuff from a simple mono. Disaccharides, though, they got to go through just a little bit of digestion first. And now they still do boost blood glucose levels pretty high, but just a tad less than a mono. And we have these intestinal enzymes, and they split or cleave the bonded pairs of a disaccharide into separate monosaccharides so that they can go and enter the blood. And so then they just make their way to the liver. And then once they get to the liver, they go through several processes, or they can go through several processes. One is they get converted to glucose, and then you use it. If you don't use it, it gets stored as glycogen. And then if you've overconsumed, what happens? It's the law of conversion of mass. We're going to talk about that in a second. So next slide here. A little more insights into those bonded pairs. So in lactose, glucose is linked to galactose. In malt sugar, you have 2 glucose units, and then you have sucrose, which is our table sugar. In sucrose, fructose and glucose are bonded together, and it's done through a refining process. And that's typically from juices. Sugar beets, sugar cane, but it does appear in some small quantities naturally in a variety of fruits and vegetables. But it's the manufacturing process, the human manufacturing process, that bonds the fructose to the glucose, and it makes it for being super sweet and hyper addictive. So next slide here. All right, so here we are, and at this point, I'm going to make a comment. While we derive energy from sugar in fruits and vegetables, it's not the same thing as eating these concentrated sweets that you find in sodas and candies and these refined sugars. There are other forces at work here. You have things like starch and fiber and insulin. So it's important to recognize the total volume of glucose response from watermelon compared to soda is vastly different, even though they share an identical glycemic indexing. And we're going to get into that. But before we do, I just want to cover complex carbs, starches, and fibers because they play a very critical role, and we're going to do that on the next slide. All right, complex carbs. Let's dive into those. They basically just contain a longer series of sugars, so that it takes the body a little bit longer to break them down. So the digestive cycle is a bit longer. So that means that you're going to get a lower amount of sugar released into your bloodstream at a more consistent rate. So foods with complex carbohydrates typically they typically have a lot greater sum of vitamins and minerals and fibers and starch. But you have to be careful. You have to be very careful because food manufacturers are tricky. They're so sneaky. They put stuff into your packaged food. So you have to look at your nutrition label and look for things like no added sugar. You want to avoid anything that's enriched or fortified. And that's so weird because it's so counterintuitive, because you'd think that, oh, if it has fortification or enrichment, it's so positive. But they're not. It's actually because they've destroyed the nutritional value and they have to manufacture it back in. So the nutritional density is much lower. And that's not even including genetically modified foods. I'm not even going to get into that in this particular episode, but we'll do that in a future video. So let's take a look. How is this practical, right? Because you're probably sitting there saying, all right, Michael, this is fantastic. This is all fun, fancy stuff. But what are good carbs? What should I be looking at? So let me break it down into categories, and we'll just go with some popular ones. So let's just start with like tubers and grains, right? My favorite is sweet potato. But you have oatmeal, you have brown rice, multigrains, potatoes, 100% whole wheat, whether it be a bread or pasta. You got beans and lentils, quinoa, couscous. And then on the fruit side of things that are complex, apples, one of my favorites, and blueberries. Not a big fan of grapefruit, but I'll eat it if I have to. You have cantaloupe, oranges, bananas, peaches, grapes, strawberries, pineapples, blackberries, pears, and so on. And then on the veggie side, broccoli is a staple for me. Asparagus, again, spinach, staple. Not a big fan of kale, but I won't do kale. But then there's peppers, there's onions, there's mushrooms, there's cucumbers, there's zucchini, carrots, and then cauliflower. So these are all excellent sources of complex carbs, and they're super nutritiously dense, and they have great fiber, and they got great starch. But as I was talking, I just had this thought about something that I've been hearing a lot regarding complex carbs, and carbs in general again. It's a new buzzword that's kind of going around. If you've heard it before, it's called lectin, and it can be found in a lot of carbohydrate sources. And I'm not going to go into that today, just the same way I'm not going to be going into gluten. And I have my own opinion on those topics, so I will do a separate video on those in the future. But in the meantime, let's just go ahead and dive into polysaccharides. And then on this slide, you're going to see here, we got this fun little starch chain. And starch, it's just simply a plant polysaccharide composed of glucose. And then after it's been denatured a little bit or cooked, the starch becomes digestible. And it's really good for human health, at least our digestive health. And starch, it's just a plant's stored form of glucose. And as that plant matures, it uses that glucose for its own needs and actually for its seeds for reproduction. And starchy foods, they're just a great source of energy, and they're a prime source of nutrition in the human diet, and they always have been. Plus, starches contain fiber and a whole lot of micronutrients, and we're going to kind of go over that now in this a little bit here with some more starches here. Let's talk about stuff like potato, bread, rice, pasta, cereal, not like just gross cereal like sugar cereal, but like even healthy cereal. They've all been kind of lumped in again and falsely classified by pop culture as being fatty. It always makes me laugh when people say, oh, that's fattening. And I'm like, actually, there's not a lot of fat in that at all. Because the reality is that gram for gram, starches contain far fewer calories than any fat. So you have, like, for example, 9 to 4. So 9 to fat, 4 to carbs. And it's another great example about the misconception around carbohydrates and the relationship to overfatness and this crazy obesity crisis that's going on. But you know, this is a good segue here because I have to make a concession. I have to concede a point. It is very, very easy to consume a ton of carbohydrates in one setting. I mean, you can. It's so easy. And that's why serving size just plays such a critical role. So it's important to remember that starch-based carbohydrates, they're like any energy source. Yes, okay, so first they're going to be converted into glucose, then they go to glycogen, but if you overconsume, and you have too many, it's going to be stored as body fat. It doesn't matter how healthy the food is, just the law of conversion of mass, that's all it is. So this is where portion control and having an active lifestyle can be super helpful because you're going to be utilizing that glucose, you're going to be utilizing that energy, and that assists in caloric energy balance or a deficit, right? It just depends on what your fitness or composition goals may be. So we're going to go to the next slide. Okay, final point of starch. There's another type, it's called resistant, and there's 4 classifications. I'm gonna breeze through these real quick. So type 1 is just found in grains, seeds, and legumes. Type 2 is found in raw or unripe food. And then 3, this is actually kind of cool. It's when you take something like potato and rice and you cook it, and then you cool it, it becomes resistant from something called retrogradation. And then type 4, it's just basically manufactured. It's another chemical process where human beings stick their nose in our nutrition, and then they actually are able to create resistant starches through a chemical process. Next slide. So fun. We're going to get into fiber here. Like starch, fibers are polysaccharides, and that's just chains of sugar, but they're different from starch because the sugar units that are held together by the bonds, they can't be broken. They can't be cleaved by the digestive enzyme in the human body. They can't break it. But the cool part is, actually it's kind of gross, but there are billions of bacteria in the large intestine, and they do possess that enzyme, and they can digest fibers to some degree through fermentation. Anyway, so here's an example. Let me give you some examples of high fiber foods in different categories. So you have barley and oatmeal, oat bran seeds, blackberries, banana, apple, orange, peach, pear, plum, black beans, kidney beans, navy, any bean's going to do it. And then veggies, I'm just going to, list some of the more prominent ones: broccoli, Brussels sprouts, carrots, and asparagus. These are all accessible for almost everybody, and they're actually relatively affordable. In most markets, unless you live in California and New York, then good luck, and you're going to pay, 200% just because, where you choose to live. Next slide. All right, fibers. They're broken into two groups based on their chemical, physical, and functional attributes. All right, so I'm going to just go over these two for you real quick. The first one that we're going to talk about is soluble. And that just basically means that the water in your system can dissolve it. And through that process of dissolution, it forms this viscous gel. And that can be digested by the bacteria in the colon through that fermentation process. And on the other end, we have our insoluble fibers, and that basically just means that they don't absorb in, or they don't dissolve in water, and they don't get that viscous gel, but they have something else that's kind of interesting. They can be found, I'm trying to give you sources where all this stuff can be found. Whole grains, the outer layer, the stringy vegetables, seeds, and any plant skin. Those are all insoluble. And the cool thing is that while they don't get that viscousness, they retain the rough texture after cooking, and they do help the body with digestion. And so that's insoluble. Next slide. Okay. Oh man, we're almost getting to the point where we're going to start diving into. We're almost there. We're going to get into hormones here in a second. But I do want to make a key point on fiber. Fiber-rich foods, lots of benefits, super significant. Doesn't matter if it's whole grains, if it's vegetables, legumes, fruits. They all have valuable vitamins, minerals, and phytochemicals. Really important. And I didn't even mention the digestive benefits in that list, but they're there. So fiber is attributed to the promotion of normal blood cholesterol. They do help tremendously in reducing blood pressure, and they aid in reducing the risk of hypertension, which is a big problem in the United States at least. They do assist with the modulation of blood glucose concentrations, and they're great for maintenance of a healthy bowel, and they do promote a healthy body composition in the right quantities. All right, next slide. This is where it starts getting fun. The glycemic index, or the GI. This is where I really get excited, because this really shows the difference in carbohydrate source. So the GI is just basically a ranking of carbohydrates, and we use it on a scale of a 0 to 100. And that basically is going to be the degree that a food source is going to raise your blood sugar level after you eat it. So foods with a high GI, those are the ones that have like the really rapidly digested food, like sugars, and that like the monodisaccharides, and that results in that spike in the glucose levels. And then if you have something low on the GI, and there's like a low GI carbohydrate, they produce very small fluctuations in your blood glucose and insulin levels, and those would be your polysaccharides. So you can see here on the glycemic index that anything over 70 is considered very high. Keep that in mind, because it's going to come into play in the glycemic yielding and glycemic load here. So let's talk about that. So now you have the glycemic load of a food, which is the number that estimates how much that food is going to raise your blood glucose level after you eat it. Think of it as an intensity gauge. So 1 unit of glycemic load is going to be an approximate the effect of consuming 1 gram of glucose. So the GL is based on the glycemic index, and we calculate the GL by multiplying the grams of an available carbohydrate in that food, and we multiply it by the food's GI, and then you just divide it by 100, and then I'm going to show you how that works on this next slide. This is so cool. Watermelon, right? Ooh, fruit. All right, it has a GI of 72. So if you look at the glycemic index, you're thinking, oh, watermelon must be bad for you, because it's ranked high on the glycemic index. But we have to take this equation through to conclusion, and let's do that together. So a serving of watermelon is 154 grams. That means that it's got about 11 grams of available carbs. And so you just got to make the calculation. It's 11G times 72 GI. You divide that by 100 and you get 7.92. Well, look at your glycemic load scale. Where does the watermelon fall on its relationship to your hormonal impact? This is basically how much insulin is being released in your body from consuming the food. It's pretty low. It's in the green. You're good to go. Now let's take something else that has the exact identical GI. Let's take a junk food. You got soda, cola. It has a GI of 72. So a serving of cola is 368 grams. It's just 12 ounces. And it has 39.8 available carbohydrates. It's almost 40. So make the calculation, 368 G times 72 GI. You divide that by 100, you get 264.96. You also get 140 calories with that. I should point out that the watermelon is only 47 calories. So think about it this way. The caloric value is triple in soda, but the effect, the hormonal effect, the response that your body is going through from ingesting the food is wildly different. Same GI, they both have sugar, very different responses in the body. This is very important to remember. One year I did have a student who made a really great point. I'm glad he did. He made a really good point in my nutrition class. And he's basically raised his hand, yes. And he mentioned that there was a serving disparity, right? So if you have 154 grams of watermelon, but 368 grams of soda, well, that's uneven. Well, okay, fair enough. That's great. I'm really glad you're paying attention. But even if you match gram for gram the servings, you still only increase the GL of watermelon to approximately 16. You still don't even break 100 calories. So not only do you only just move into moderately high GL, but you're now consuming over 2.5 cups of watermelon, right? And most people aren't going to eat 2 cups of watermelon. They're not. How many times have you seen, maybe at a picnic in the summer on occasion you see somebody power through some watermelon, but I have seen people slam 2 cans of soda back to back all the time. And I'm not talking about diet soda, which I'm not even going to talk about diet soda today, but just straight up regular soda, full calorie, full sugar. Think about that, 2 cans. So that means that you have just taken in 280 calories, but you've just taken on a glycemic response, or glycemic, well, I'm going to get the response, but glycemic response of 530. So not only are you like way off the charts, you're so far off the charts you're not even in the same universe. So you cannot chemically or scientifically compare a watermelon to a soda. It doesn't work. Apples to oranges? No, bad. That's not a good one. Okay. But I think that does express that while some fruit does share the same glycemic index with the junk food, the hormonal and glucose response are just completely different. And let's look at that a little bit deeper. Let's go into one more thing here on that. Let's go for the grand finale here. Let's talk hormones. Once your carbs are absorbed into your bloodstream, you just pounded your soda, you release a ton of insulin, right? The insulin goes up. So the rise and fall of blood glucose and the duration that it remains elevated is your glycemic response. And now complex carbs and minimally processed starchy foods, they produce a very different response than the simple carbs, as we just discovered on the last slide. We just looked at that. But other factors include how much food you eat at one setting. It could be things like how the food is processed, and it could even be how the food is prepared. Like an undercooked noodle actually has a lower glycemic response than an overcooked noodle because of the process of denaturing. So think about it this way. No matter what you eat, insulin is going to be aggravated, right? So insulin and glucagon, they're going to work together and they're going to try and create some kind of metabolic homeostasis. So once you get a big spike of sugar, you get a big spike of insulin. And this is the key. The moment your insulin is released, you're no longer converting any stored energy of any kind. That includes body fat. Think about that for a second. So look at this graph. The red spikes are the insulin beta response to glucose, and the blue represents the alpha glucagon reply over time. So if you eat something that's super, super high on the glycemic yield scale, then you're going to get a big spike of insulin, and it's going to take a long time for it to come down. So that means that whole time you're out of stored energy burning, and you're only you have to burn out that insulin and the glucose in your system before you can move on into new energy sources. Now, as that insulin level and the glucose levels come down, glucagon is released, and it brings that body back into homeostasis. And I want to express how incredibly I'm oversimplifying this, but I just want you to understand the basics, just the really basics, the fundamentals to help you put all this together so that you can make good decisions. So to reiterate, the height and the frequency of your elevated blood sugar directly correlate to your ability to convert body fat for energy. Technically, lipolysis, okay? Directly related. We're wrapping it up here. So let me go to nutrition labels. All right, so let's take a look at this here. The nutrition facts label, it's gonna list the types of carbs and it's gonna make all the total makeup of carbs in a product. That includes your dietary fiber and your sugars and your percent of daily value. I have noticed recently a lot of some of the major labels, they're including other things like their soluble or insoluble fibers. I've been seeing sugar alcohols being listed now. And if you ever see other carbohydrates, they typically mean starch. But let me give you some FDA guidelines. These are interesting, right? So the daily value for total carbohydrates per person for a 2,000 calorie diet is 300 grams. So again, remember that's based on a 2,000 calorie diet, 300 grams. It may not be the right serving for you. No matter what though, the goal is that you do want to get to 100% of your daily value for total carbohydrates. Your daily value, not a generic average. The FDA makes some other points that I'm just going to outline here for you. They think that if you have anything, one single product or meal of carbohydrates that's less than 5% of your daily value, it's too low because then by accumulation, you're not going to add enough carbs. And then if you have 20%, then you're probably going to get too much. They think that's high. But my question is this. Do you really need 300 carbs in your lifestyle with your movement and with the things that you do and your activity levels and your exercise? And do you need 300 carbs? I don't. I don't even need 300 carbs. I don't operate at my peak capacity on 300 carbs on a sedentary day. I'm typically looking for 200. So 200. About 800 calories of my intake can come from carbs on a sedentary day. I will bump it up though. You have to be agile. You can't be stuck in like this, I only eat this many per day. It depends on my energy output, right? So if my energy output is really high, I need higher levels of energy. So when I'm like backcountry backpacking or I'm doing something like that, then I'm definitely going to be taking in a lot more complex carbohydrates. And in some case, for like durations of intense activity, I'll take in some simple carbohydrates on purpose. But that's because I'm planning and preparing and I'm managing my food and nutrition lifestyle. Anyway. There is also a little bit of research that's been going around that's just been showing that humans have much higher levels of cognitive function at about 130 grams or more of carb intake. And you know what, if you're interested in that, just do a quick web search. You can find peer-reviewed articles out there and there's some pretty interesting findings. But just one last point on the nutrition label. Carbs are broken down by total grams per serving and the percent of daily value on the nutrition label. So pay attention to that. But most importantly, right under carbohydrates, look at the sugars. That's going to be really important to you. That's going to determine how much of that is complex versus simple. Okay, because the sugars are going to be simple. So final slide. We're almost there. All right. In conclusion, carbohydrates are not necessarily good or bad, but some are definitely better than others, as we've just explored. And it's your decisions. And it's the volume of consumption. Now that can be good or bad. So I just want to remind y'all that you have to take personal responsibility for your fitness and nutrition. People hate hearing this. Carbs don't make us fat. Our choices make us fat. And that includes choices about carbohydrates. And I understand, I totally understand that so many people are they're suffering. People are struggling right now. Body fat composition, and physique management is really, really hard. And I empathize. You know why? Because I go through this stuff. I go through periods of frustration and I get challenged sometimes. As we get older, our metabolisms change and our bodies change and we have to make adaptation to that. And it can be frustrating, I get it. And in the past, I think that we ran into trouble because of a lack of information. I think we just didn't know. And we didn't even know we didn't know. We were unconsciously incompetent. And as food practices changed and manufacturing practices changed, and then our food quality sources changed, we didn't adapt. And so I think that put us in a really crappy spot, frankly. But I think there's something else too. While it used to be a lack of information, now, with the media and the internet, it's all about misinformation. That's a fact. As a culture, unfortunately, this is the reality, that we always seek the easy path to instant gratification. But when our consumption turns on us, we keep the same mentality of I want it now. And what do we do? We look for shortcuts, we go for fad diets, we go into like these excessive food source exclusion, like, oh, I can't eat that. You know, we go for pills and we go for gimmicks. We go for the promise of immediate success, and it's all fake. It's all false. It's all taking advantage of your vulnerability and of your pain. And if you want to stop the pain, then you can own it. You can make change. You can be successful with your fitness and nutrition lifestyle. And if you do have a medical condition that carbs aggravate, then just keep going. Keep fine-tuning your intake until you find that right combination of foods that work for you. On the other side, don't self-diagnose. Don't self-diagnose and create these unnecessary personal burdens, because you know what you always do? You always put that burden on everybody else around you. It's maddening to me. So all you got to do is you just got to get active. The American College of Sports Medicine says just 150 minutes a week is relatively sufficient for most people in a week, right? And just don't eat more than you consume. Just make better food choices as it relates to your carbohydrates, and for every food type at that matter, for that matter, you just think about you are what you eat. And it does take time, right? It takes time to do it right, and you want it to be permanent. You want this to be sustainable. Anyway, to kind of wrap this up, I hope that this presentation gave you some knowledge and empowered you to take action so you can start to recognize foods that contribute not just to your health, but your overall vitality. So please be sure to like this and share this video all over social media. Spread the truth. Stay tuned though for the next installment of this series, and I do appreciate it. Thank you for watching.